Miss Marple and the Tragedy at Wetherby Cottage. Welcome to Cafe Tales, I'm Ailey, and it's lovely to have you with us. Quick question, do you enjoy crisp winter evenings or sunlit summer afternoons more? Let us know in the comments and do subscribe for daily stories. Now on to tonight's tale. Chapter 1. A Visitor in the Snow. The branch line from Much Benham had been quite impossible since Thursday afternoon. Miss Marple, gazing from the window of the second-class carriage as the train crawled its way through the frozen countryside, reflected that she had been rather foolish to attempt the journey at all. But dear Constance Langdon had been so pressing in her invitation, and Miss Marple had always found it difficult to disappoint an old friend, particularly one who wrote with such evident loneliness in every line. The snow lay thick upon the fields, transforming the familiar English landscape into something foreign and dreamlike. Here and there a dark hedge broke through the white expanse, and occasionally a farmhouse chimney sent up a thin column of smoke into the gray December sky. Miss Marple pulled her traveling rug more closely about her knees and returned to her knitting, though her mind remained alert to the conversation of her fellow passengers. There were only 3 others in the compartment. A red-faced farmer dozed in the corner, his breath making small clouds in the cold air. Opposite Miss Marple sat a woman of perhaps 45, respectably dressed in black, with a pinched mouth that suggested habitual disapproval. Beside her, a younger woman with a pleasant open face clutched a basket and spoke in a low, urgent tone. Such a dreadful thing, Mrs. Pettigrew. Poor Mrs. Wetherby, and so young, too. These modern girls, said Mrs. Pettigrew, her thin lips compressing further, coming down from London with their ideas and their independence. Village life doesn't suit them. That's what I always said. But to die like that, gas is a treacherous thing. I've always maintained that those newfangled heaters are dangerous. Give me a good coal fire any day. Miss Marple's needles continued their steady clicking, but her faded blue eyes had become very bright indeed. Poor Mr. Wetherby, the younger woman continued. They say he went quite to pieces when he found her. Came back from the station and there she was. Mrs. Pettigrew sniffed. I dare say he'll recover soon enough. These men always do. And she did have that money from her aunt, didn't she? Mrs. Pettigrew? I'm only saying what everyone's thinking, Annie Carter. Mark my words, there'll be talk. The train gave a prolonged whistle and began to slow. Through the window, Miss Marple could make out a small station platform deep in snow. A painted sign announced that they had reached Lower Wetherby. This is my stop, said Miss Marple pleasantly, gathering her belongings. I wonder if you might be so kind as to help me with my case from the rack. The farmer woke with a start and obligingly hauled down the small trunk. As Miss Marple prepared to alight, she turned with an apologetic smile. I couldn't help overhearing your conversation. Such a tragedy for your village. I'm visiting Mrs. Langdon at Rose Cottage. Perhaps you know her? Everyone knows Mrs. Langdon, said Annie Carter warmly. You'll be very comfortable there, I'm sure. Though I expect she'll have told you all about poor Mrs. Wetherby by now. She was one of the first to hear of it. Accident, was it? Inquired Miss Marple mildly, stepping down onto the platform. The gas heater. They say faulty valve or some such thing. She was found in the morning room, poor soul. The doctor said she wouldn't have suffered. How very dreadful, murmured Miss Marple. Mrs. Pettigrew leaned forward. If you're staying with Mrs. Langdon, you'll be just down the lane from Wetherby Cottage. You can practically see it from her parlor window, though I shouldn't think Mr. Wetherby will be receiving visitors just now. Naturally not, said Miss Marple. Good afternoon to you both. The cold struck her face like a blow as she made her way along the platform. A porter emerged from the station house, stamping his feet. Cab, miss, or are you being met? Mrs. Langdon was to send someone, Miss Marple replied, But in this weather, here's young Tom now. A cart approached through the snow, drawn by a sturdy pony. The driver, a boy of perhaps 17, touched his cap. Miss Marple? Mrs. Langdon sent me to fetch you. Bit of a journey, but the roads are just passable if we're careful. The ride to Rose Cottage took the better part of 40 minutes. Tom proved to be a talkative companion, pointing out landmarks buried beneath the snow and commenting on the hardships the storm had brought to the village. But inevitably, as Miss Marple had suspected he would, he turned to the recent tragedy. Terrible business about Mrs. Wetherby, miss. Everyone's talking of it. They were married not a year yet, and now this. How did it happen exactly? Asked Miss Marple. Gas poisoning, miss. Mr. Wetherby had gone up to Much Benham on business, or so they say. When he came back next morning, there she was, dead in her chair. The constable says the heater must have had a leak. How very unfortunate. Was she alone in the house then? Seems so, miss. He hesitated. Yes. Well, miss, Mr. Alcott, who lives next door, he says he saw a light moving about in the cottage garden that night. Near 10 o'clock, he reckons. But Mr. Wetherby says he didn't get back till past midnight, having missed his train and stayed at the inn. Perhaps it was Mrs. Wetherby herself with a lantern. In the garden, miss? On the coldest night of the year, and her found dead inside? Miss Marple said nothing, but her fingers worked thoughtfully at her knitting. Rose Cottage appeared at last, a cheerful house despite the snow that lay heavy on its thatched roof. The door flew open before they had quite stopped, and Mrs. Langdon emerged, bundled in shawls, her round face creased with relief. Jane? Oh, my dear Jane, I was so worried the train wouldn't get through. Come in at once! Tom, bring the trunk inside. There's a good boy. The interior of Rose Cottage was everything Miss Marple had hoped for. Warm, cluttered with comfortable furniture, and smelling pleasantly of tea and fresh baking. Mrs. Langdon, talking all the while, ushered her guest into the parlor and pressed her into the best chair by the fire. You must be frozen through. I'll have Mrs. Blake bring tea immediately. Oh, Jane, I'm so glad you've come. The village has been in such a state since Thursday, and I've hardly known what to think. The young woman who died, said Miss Marple gently. Mrs. Langdon's comfortable face crumpled. Poor Clara Wetherby. Such a tragedy, and so very strange. But I mustn't burden you with village troubles the moment you arrive. On the contrary, said Miss Marple, her needles resuming their steady rhythm. I find village troubles are very much the same everywhere, and I should be glad to hear what happened, if you feel like telling me. Mrs. Langdon needed no further encouragement. Chapter 2. The Cottage by the Gate, Theo. Tea had grown cold in Miss Marple's cup as Mrs. Langdon recounted the circumstances of Clara Wetherby's death. Outside, the early winter darkness had fallen, and the windows of Rose Cottage reflected back the warm glow of lamplight. The constable called it an accident straight away, Mrs. Langdon said, refilling Miss Marple's cup from a fresh pot. Dr. Haydock examined her and said it was gas poisoning, quite definitely. The poor girl must have fallen asleep in her chair by the heater. Well, these things do happen, don't they? They do indeed, murmured Miss Marple, though I understand Mr. Wetherby was away from home at the time. The inspector closed his notebook. Henry Wetherby, I'm arresting you for the murder of your wife, Clara Wetherby. You'll need to come with me now. As Constable Mellis placed the handcuffs on Henry's wrists, the prisoner looked at Miss Marple with something like bewilderment. How did you know? How could you possibly have known? Miss Marple's expression was infinitely sad. Because I've seen it before, Mr. Wetherby. Not precisely the same circumstances, but the same pattern. A man who cannot bear to lose what he considers his property. A careful plan executed with precision. And always, small inconsistencies that reveal the truth to those who know how to look for them. 2 teacups, Henry said bitterly. You mentioned that the first time we met? A woman seldom makes tea for herself in 2 cups, Miss Marple repeated. 1 cup for her, 1 for the visitor she expected or thought she expected. But you were the visitor, Mr. Wetherby, and the 2nd cup was never meant to be drunk at all. The next morning, Miss Marple sat with Mrs. Langdon in the comfortable parlor of Rose Cottage, watching the snow fall once more over Lower Wetherby. Inspector Graves had called earlier to take her full statement and to thank her for her assistance. The telegram has been traced, he told her. James Rowe has been contacted in London. He confirms he'd been corresponding with Mrs. Wetherby and had urged her to leave her husband. He's quite devastated by the news. Mrs. Langdon wiped her eyes with her handkerchief. It's the first time tragedy has touched our little village. Jane, I can hardly believe it happened here, in our quiet corner of the world. Tragedy can happen anywhere, my dear, Miss Marple said gently, her needles clicking in their steady rhythm. Villages are not immune to human nature, and human nature is much the same everywhere. Love, jealousy, possessiveness. These emotions don't respect geography. But to kill one's own wife? Love, when it turns to possession, is far more dangerous than hate, Miss Marple observed softly. Hate admits its nature openly, but possession disguises itself as love, as devotion, as caring. It never admits itself guilty, even when it destroys what it claims to cherish. Through the window they could see Wetherby Cottage in the distance, its windows dark, its door locked. The snow was covering it slowly, gently, as though nature itself wished to draw a veil over what had happened there. Poor Clara, Mrs. Langdon murmured. To die so young and so alone. She was not alone at the end, Miss Marple said quietly. Her husband was with her, watching her die. That, I think, is the most terrible part of all. She trusted him enough to drink the tea he gave her, never knowing it would be her last. They sat in silence for a moment, listening to the ticking of the clock and the soft whisper of snow against the window panes. Will you stay through Christmas, Jane? Mrs. Langdon asked at last. I should so enjoy your company, though I fear Lower Wetherby has shown you a rather grim side. Miss Marple smiled and patted her friend's hand. I should be delighted to stay, Constance. Every village has its secrets, its small tragedies, but they also have their kindnesses, their friendships, their quiet joys. I found both here, as one does everywhere. Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering Wetherby Cottage in cold, immaculate silence. Yes, he had gone up to Much Benham on the Wednesday afternoon, some business matter. I believe the storm came up suddenly that evening, and by morning the roads were quite impossible. He'd been expected back that same night, but of course he couldn't manage it. Miss Marple's fingers moved methodically through her knitting. How very distressing for him to return and find such a tragedy. Oh, it was dreadful, Jane. Quite dreadful. He came to the door himself, white as a sheet, and asked Dr. Haydock to come at once. By the time I heard of it, the constable was already there, and Clara had been, well, attended to. Had you known Mrs. Wetherby well? Mrs. Langdon hesitated, her comfortable face troubled. Not as well as I might have wished. She was a London girl, you see, and I think she found Lower Wetherby rather quiet after the city. She was always perfectly civil, but there was a sort of, oh, I don't quite know how to put it, a sort of reserve about her, as though she were keeping something back. This, Miss Marple reflected, was precisely the sort of observation that proved most useful. She encouraged her friend with a gentle murmur. She and Henry had been married in February, a whirlwind courtship, people said. He met her while visiting his cousin in town, and within 3 months they were wed. She inherited some money from an aunt shortly before the wedding, nothing enormous, but enough to make a difference to a young couple. They took Wetherby Cottage, and at first everything seemed quite satisfactory. But later, well, one heard things. Mrs. Pettigrew, you may have met her on the train. Rather an uncharitable woman. She claimed there were quarrels about money, I think. And Clara did seem restless, particularly these last few weeks. She spoke once of going up to London for the Christmas season, but Henry wouldn't hear of it. Miss Marple made a small sound that might have been sympathy or merely acknowledgement. "I shouldn't speak ill of the dead," Mrs. Langdon said quickly. But there was talk that Clara found marriage, well, different from what she'd expected. She'd been quite independent before, with a position in a shop, I believe, or perhaps an office. The village life, the isolation, it may have weighed upon her. And Mr. Wetherby himself, a quiet man, reserved, I should say. He works as a clerk at the solicitor's office in Much Benham, always very correct, very proper, perhaps a bit. She paused, searching for the word. A bit possessive of Clara. Watchful, if you understand me. Miss Marple understood very well indeed. The following morning dawned clear and cold. Miss Marple, rising early as was her habit, found Mrs. Langdon already in the kitchen, consulting with her cook about the day's meals. "I thought I might take some flowers to Mr. Wetherby," Miss Marple suggested. Just a small gesture of sympathy from a visitor to the village. Would that be appropriate, do you think? How very kind of you, Jane. I'm sure he would appreciate it, though I warn you, the cottage is just down the lane, and you'll see where it happened. If you find it too distressing, I shall manage, said Miss Marple calmly. The walk to Wetherby Cottage took barely 5 minutes. It stood alone at the end of a narrow lane, separated from its nearest neighbor by a considerable garden, now buried in snow. The cottage itself was a modest affair, neat and well-maintained, with dark windows that seemed to watch Miss Marple's approach. She knocked at the door, a small bunch of chrysanthemums held in her gloved hand. After a moment, it opened to reveal a man of perhaps 35, tall and spare, with dark hair carefully parted, and a face that might have been handsome had it not been so rigidly controlled. "Mr. Wetherby? I'm Miss Marple, a friend of Mrs. Langdon's. I hope you'll forgive the intrusion, but I wanted to express my condolences." His eyes, she noted, were a peculiar light gray, and they examined her with an intensity that was almost disconcerting before he stepped back. "How kind." "Please do come in." The interior of the cottage was as neat as its exterior. Too neat, perhaps, for a household in the first shock of bereavement. The small entrance hall led directly into a sitting room furnished with modest taste, a sofa and 2 chairs, a writing desk by the window, a bookcase against one wall. Everything was precisely arranged, as though the room were a stage set rather than a lived-in space. "I'll find something for the flowers," Henry Wetherby said, disappearing through a doorway Miss Marple took to be the kitchen. Left alone, she made the most of her opportunity. The grate held the cold remains of a fire. On the mantelpiece stood a clock and 2 candlesticks arranged with geometric precision. The writing desk caught her attention. It was closed, but a small key protruded from the lock. Through the doorway to her left, Miss Marple glimpsed what must be the morning room. Her eyes took in the tea tray on a small table, 2 cups and saucers, a teapot, a milk jug. The cups appeared unused, but they had certainly been set out. A faint scent lingered in the air, something floral beneath the smell of cold smoke, and yes, unmistakably gas. "Here we are." Miss Marple turned as Henry Wetherby reappeared with a vase. His movements, she observed, were careful and deliberate, almost rehearsed. "Such a terrible loss for you," she said gently as he arranged the flowers. "I understand your wife was very young." 26. His voice was flat. "We had been married less than a year. Mrs. Langdon mentioned that you were away when—" "It happened, yes, business in Much Benham. I intended to return that same evening, but the storm—" He gestured vaguely toward the window. "I was forced to remain at the inn." "How very unfortunate," to come home and find she was in there. He nodded toward the morning room. In her chair. The heater had been left burning, and the valve. The doctor said she wouldn't have suffered. It would have been like falling asleep. Miss Marple moved slightly as though to get a better view of the morning room. What a charming room. She must have spent a great deal of time there. Clara enjoyed her morning tea there. The light was good for reading, but the curtains, Miss Marple noticed, were heavy and drawn. And there, near the window, yes, the latch appeared to be broken, hanging at an odd angle. Yet someone had forced the window shut nonetheless, for a piece of string had been wound tightly around the handle. "I must be going," she said, though she would have given a great deal to examine that window more closely. "Please accept my deepest sympathies, Mr. Wetherby. If there is anything Mrs. Langdon or I might do—" "You're very kind." His courtesy was impeccable, but his eyes remained oddly distant, as though he were performing a role he had learned by heart. As Miss Marple walked back up the lane, she reflected on what she'd seen. 2 teacups set out. A window latch broken but secured. A room too tidy for genuine grief. And Henry Wetherby's carefully modulated responses, each word chosen with precision, each gesture controlled. She had known a man once in St. Mary Mead who had spoken in just such a measured way after his wife's death. That, too, had been ruled an accident. It had not been an accident at all. Chapter 3. A Marriage. 2 new Miss Marple returned to Rose Cottage to find Mrs. Langdon entertaining a visitor in the parlor. The woman rose as Miss Marple entered, revealing herself to be the pleasant-faced Annie Carter from the train. "Miss Marple." "How lovely. Annie has just brought some eggs from her sister's farm. Do join us for tea." The conversation turned, as Miss Marple had anticipated it would, to the tragedy at Wetherby Cottage. "I've just come from there," Miss Marple said, settling into her chair. "Mr. Wetherby was kind enough to receive me, though I felt quite the intruder." "How did he seem?" Annie Carter asked, leaning forward with the eager curiosity of one who genuinely cares rather than merely gossips. "Composed. Perhaps rather too composed for a man so recently." "Bereaved." Mrs. Langdon poured the tea with a thoughtful expression. Henry was always one to keep his feelings to himself. Even as a boy, his mother used to say he never cried when he fell or showed temper when crossed. Just that same calm, blank look. "He grew up in the village, then?" "Oh, yes, born and raised at Elm House, just beyond the church. His parents are both gone now, and the house was sold some years ago. I think that's partly why he took Wetherby Cottage when he married. It's the nearest thing to his childhood home still available to let." Annie Carter set down her cup with a gentle clink. "Mrs. Wetherby, Clara, I mean, she told me once that Henry liked everything just so. The cottage had to be kept in perfect order, she said. And heaven help her if she moved anything from its proper place." "Some men are particular that way," observed Miss Marple mildly. "Oh, but it was more than that, miss. She said he would notice if her book was an inch out of position, or if she'd used a different teacup than usual. It made her nervous. She told me it made her feel watched." Mrs. Langdon shifted uncomfortably. "Annie, I'm not sure we should—" "I'm only repeating what poor Clara said to me herself not 3 weeks ago. She came to my sister's farm to buy eggs, and we got to talking. She seemed, oh, I don't know how to put it, trapped somehow. Said marriage wasn't what she'd expected at all." Miss Marple's needles clicked steadily. "Had she been engaged before, do you know?" "There was talk of someone in London," Mrs. Langdon admitted, "before she met Henry, but I don't know the particulars." "James Rowe. His name was," Annie said. Clara mentioned him once, then caught herself and wouldn't say more. "But I got the impression there had been an understanding between them before Mr. Wetherby came along." "And the money from her aunt?" Miss Marple inquired. "That came before the marriage," Mrs. Langdon said. "Just before—" Yes, about a month before the wedding, I believe. Mrs. Langdon's comfortable face showed distress. Oh, Jane, you don't think... Surely the money had nothing to do with... I think nothing at all, said Miss Marple placidly. I merely find it interesting that a young woman with independent means would choose to marry so quickly, and then find herself unhappy within the year. Annie Carter nodded vigorously. That's just what puzzled me, miss. Clara had a position and prospects. She worked for a publisher in Bloomsbury. Quite a good situation. For a woman, and then she gave it all up for lower, Wetherby in a clerk's cottage. Love makes us do strange things, murmured Mrs. Langdon. But she sounded doubtful. Or fear, said Miss Marple quietly. The two women looked at her in surprise. Fear, Miss Marple? Sometimes we make choices not because we desire something, but because we wish to escape something else. A young woman with money and independence who rushes into marriage? Well, it might be love, certainly, but it might also be something quite different. After Annie Carter had departed, Miss Marple helped Mrs. Langdon clear away the tea things. As they worked, she said casually, You mentioned quarrels between the Wetherbys. About money, Mrs. Pettigrew thought, so she claimed, though how she would know I'm sure I can't say. Still, Clara did mention to me once that Henry was very interested in how she invested her inheritance. Wanted her to put it all in his name, for convenience, but she'd kept it in her own account, and I gathered he wasn't pleased. How very imprudent of her. Mrs. Langdon looked startled. Imprudent? To let her husband know she didn't trust him. That sort of thing rankles in a certain type of man. Oh, Jane, surely you don't mean... I mean only that marriage is always a matter of trust. My dear, and when that trust is absent on either side, it creates a most uncomfortable situation. That evening, as Miss Marple sat by the fire with her knitting, Mrs. Langdon returned from a visit to the vicarage with fresh intelligence. The vicar's wife tells me that Clara Wetherby received a visitor last week. A gentleman from London, she said, though she didn't catch his name. He called at the cottage on Tuesday afternoon while Henry was at his office. Miss Marple's needles paused for just a fraction of a moment. Indeed, how interesting. Mrs. Clement, that's the vicar's wife, she happened to be passing and saw him at the door. A well-dressed man, she said, with a London look about him. Clara seemed quite agitated to see him. Agitated in what way? Distressed, perhaps, or excited? Mrs. Clement couldn't quite tell, but she noticed that Clara kept looking up and down the lane as though afraid of being observed. The gentleman stayed perhaps 20 minutes, and when he left, Clara stood at the door, watching him go with the strangest expression on her face. And this was on Tuesday, you say? Yes. Clara died on Wednesday night, or rather Thursday morning, when Henry found her. Miss Marple resumed her knitting, but her mind was far from the pattern she was working. A visitor from London, a woman with money who had kept it in her own name, a husband who liked everything in perfect order and noticed the slightest deviation, a marriage of less than a year that had already turned sour. And most significant of all, 2 teacups set out in that too-neat morning room, one for Clara Wetherby, and one for a visitor who had been expected but had never drunk the tea prepared for him, or had never been intended to drink it at all. Did Mrs. Clement mention, Miss Marple asked, whether Henry Wetherby knew about this visitor? She couldn't say, but Clara did tell her when they met at the post office the next morning that she expected to be going to London soon. She seemed quite definite about it, Mrs. Clement said, though she wouldn't explain further. Going to London, repeated Miss Marple softly. How very significant. Significant? But Jane, the poor girl, never did go to London. She died that very night. Precisely, said Miss Marple, and would say no more on the subject, though Mrs. Langdon pressed her several times before giving up and retiring to bed. But Miss Marple sat by the dying fire for some time after her friend had gone upstairs, her hand still at last, her eyes fixed on the glowing embers. She was thinking of a parlor maid she had once known in St. Mary Mead, a girl who had planned to leave her situation and marry her sweetheart. That girl, too, had died suddenly and conveniently, just before she could carry out her intention. That death had been called an accident as well. But it had not been an accident, and neither, Miss Marple was increasingly certain, was this. Chapter 4. A cup left untouched. The village constable, a stalwart man named Bert Melis, proved unexpectedly amenable to Miss Marple's gentle request to view Wetherby Cottage once more. "Seeing as you're helping Mrs. Langdon with the relief parcels, Miss, and as Mr. Wetherby has gone up to Much Benham to make arrangements with the undertaker, I don't suppose there's any harm in it, though there's nothing much to see. Really, Dr. Haydock was quite clear it was an accident." "I'm sure he was," said Miss Marple, following him down the now familiar lane. "Still, I thought if I could get a sense of the room where poor Mrs. Wetherby spent her last hours, I might choose an appropriate memorial wreath. One likes to be tasteful in these matters." It was a thin excuse, but Constable Melis accepted it without question. He unlocked the door and led Miss Marple through the neat sitting room into the morning room beyond. The room was smaller than Miss Marple had supposed. From her brief glimpse 2 days earlier, perhaps 12 feet square, with a single window overlooking the garden. The furniture consisted of a comfortable armchair positioned near the gas heater, a small table beside it, a writing bureau against the wall, and a bookcase containing a modest collection of novels. Miss Marple's eyes went immediately to the tea tray on the table. 2 cups and saucers, exactly as she had observed before. The constable followed her gaze. "Found her right there in that chair, Mr. Wetherby did. The doctor said she'd been dead several hours. The gas heater was still burning when he arrived. Valve turned low, but enough to fill the room with fumes. She wouldn't have known a thing about it. Poor lady." "How merciful," murmured Miss Marple, moving closer to examine the tea tray. The cups were of good quality china with a delicate pattern of roses. 1 cup showed the brown stain of tea that had been poured and partially drunk. The other was pristine, though it too had been filled. A ring of dried tea leaves marked the bottom of the cup, where the liquid had long since evaporated. But it was the first cup that held Miss Marple's attention. Around the rim, just where the lips would have touched, was a faint white residue, barely visible unless one looked closely. Miss Marple bent forward, peering at it with the innocent curiosity of an elderly woman whose eyesight was not what it had been. "The tea was made that evening, I suppose?" she asked. "Must have been, miss. Mr. Wetherby said his wife often had a cup of tea in the evening, liked to read by the fire before bed. He'd left for Much Benham around 3 that afternoon, and she was alive and well when he said goodbye. And yet 2 cups, said Miss Marple thoughtfully. Do you suppose she was expecting someone? The constable scratched his head. Now that's a bit odd, I'll grant you. Mr. Wetherby mentioned it himself when I asked. Said his wife must have thought he'd be back that evening and set out a cup for him, though that don't quite make sense. Seeing as he told her he might be staying over if the weather turned. Perhaps she was expecting a different visitor altogether. Well, if she was, they never came. Or if they did, they didn't drink their tea. That second cup wasn't touched, as you can see. Miss Marple could indeed see. The untouched cup told its own story, of someone expected, someone for whom tea had been poured in anticipation, but that someone had never drunk it, or had never been given the opportunity to drink it. A woman seldom makes tea for herself in 2 cups, she said, more to herself than to the constable. What's that, miss? Oh, merely thinking aloud. Tell me, constable, was there anything else unusual about the room when Mr. Wetherby discovered his wife? Melis considered. The window was shut tight, which is as it should be on a cold night. The fire in the grate had burned down to nothing. The heater was on, as I said, and there was a letter on the bureau, half written by the look of it. A letter? How interesting. Was it addressed to anyone? Now that I couldn't tell you, miss. Mr. Wetherby took it up before I could have a proper look. Said it was private, and I suppose he had the right of it, being her husband and all. Miss Marple moved to the bureau, a small piece of furniture with a slanted writing surface and several small drawers. The surface was empty now, but she could see a faint indentation in the leather top where a sheet of paper had rested. The inkwell was nearly full, and a pen lay beside it, the nib still slightly damp, as though it had been used recently. The letter was here when you arrived? Right there on the top, miss, just lying there open as though she'd been interrupted in the middle of writing it. I see. And the envelope? There wasn't one that I noticed, just the letter itself. Miss Marple's fingers traced the edge of the bureau thoughtfully. No envelope suggested the letter had not been completed, or perhaps had not been intended for posting at all. A letter interrupted, or a letter deliberately left unfinished. She turned her attention to the window. The broken latch she had observed before hung uselessly, but someone had indeed secured the window with string, winding it tightly around both the handle on the inside and what must be a nail or hook on the outside frame. It was an improvised solution, but an effective one. This window latch has been broken for some time, I imagine. Couldn't say for certain, miss, but it looks like an old break to me. The string's been there a while, judging by the dust on it. But Miss Marple's experienced eye noted something the constable had missed. While the string itself was dusty, the knot was fresh, tied recently, with none of the grime that should have accumulated had it been in place for any length of time. Someone had retied that string quite recently indeed. She peered through the glass at the garden beyond. Snow still lay thick upon the ground, though it had begun to melt in patches where the weak winter sun had found it. The garden was small and enclosed by a hedge on 3 sides, with a gate leading to the lane on the 4th. Were there any footprints in the snow, Constable? When Mr. Wetherby discovered his wife, I mean? Ah, now that's an interesting question, miss. There were indeed footprints, Mr. Wetherby's own, coming from the gate to the front door. But there was another set too, fainter, altar-like, leading from the back door through the garden to the hedge. I followed them myself, I did. They went straight through the hedge. There's a gap there, see? And out into the field beyond. And you think those prints were Mr. Wetherby's as well? The constable looked uncomfortable. Well, miss, that's what he said. Said he'd gone around the back to check the coal shed when he first arrived, being as the front of the house was dark, and he wondered if his wife might be sleeping. But the prints didn't match his boots, not exactly. Smaller they were, and lighter in the snow as though made by someone not so heavy. How very curious, said Miss Marple. Did you mention this discrepancy to Mr. Wetherby? I did, miss, and he explained it away easy enough. Said he must have gone out the back way earlier in the week before the snow fell so deep. Said I was confusing old prints with new ones. And were you? Constable Mellis met her mild gaze with a troubled expression. I don't rightly know, miss. The snow fell heavy Wednesday night, and those prints looked fresh to me Thursday morning, but I'm no expert. And Dr. Haydock was satisfied it was an accident, so I didn't press the matter. Miss Marple returned to the tea tray, her mind working through the evidence with the methodical precision of a woman accustomed to untangling village mysteries. 2 cups set out, 1 drunk from, bearing that curious white residue. 1 untouched, the tea evaporated away. A letter interrupted. A window secured with freshly tied string. Footprints that did not quite match. And underneath it all, the faint but persistent smell of gas mixing with something else. Something floral and sweet that Miss Marple now identified as face powder. Clara Wetherby's face powder, presumably from a compact that must have been open on the table or in her lap when she died. Or perhaps from powder that had been added to something else entirely. Thank you, Constable, Miss Marple said, straightening up. You've been most helpful. I believe I have all the information I need for the memorial wreath. As they left the cottage, Miss Marple paused at the front gate and looked back at the house. It sat quietly in its coating of snow, innocent and tranquil, giving no sign of the questions that troubled her. But Miss Marple had learned long ago that the most peaceful-looking houses could harbor the darkest secrets, and that a cup of tea, that most English and innocent of beverages, could be as deadly as any exotic poison when placed in the wrong hands. Chapter 5. The neighbors' footprints. Miss Marple had long held the view that neighbors, particularly in villages, possessed a knowledge of one another's affairs that was both comprehensive and remarkably accurate. It was with this principle in mind that she suggested to Mrs. Langdon a visit to Mr. Alcott, whose cottage stood nearest to the Wetherbys. "He's a retired schoolmaster," Mrs. Langdon explained as they made their way along the lane that afternoon. "Came here 5 years ago from Sussex, a quiet man, rather solitary but always perfectly civil. He keeps bees, I believe, and has quite a fine garden in summer." Mr. Alcott's cottage was larger than Wetherby's, a substantial building of gray stone with a well-maintained appearance. The gentleman himself answered their knock, revealing a tall, spare figure of perhaps 60, with keen gray eyes behind gold-rimmed spectacles. "Mrs. Langdon, good afternoon. And this must be your visitor from St. Mary Mead." Miss Marple, who had made no mention of her home village, smiled pleasantly. "You're very well informed, Mr. Alcott. One hears things," he said with a slight smile. "In a village the size of Lower Wetherby, news travels rather efficiently. Do come in." His sitting room was lined with books and smelled faintly of tobacco and leather. A fire burned cheerfully in the grate, and by the window stood a writing desk covered with papers and what appeared to be botanical drawings. "We've come to ask a favor," said Mrs. Langdon when they were settled. "Miss Marple is organizing a memorial collection for poor Mrs. Wetherby, and we thought you might contribute, being their nearest neighbor." It was a fiction they had agreed upon, and Mr. Alcott accepted it with a courteous nod. But his eyes, Miss Marple noticed, held a shrewd understanding that suggested he knew perfectly well they had come for information rather than donations. "A terrible tragedy," he said. "I still can hardly credit it. To think of that young woman dying alone just yards away from where I sat that evening, and I knew nothing of it until morning." "You were at home that night, then?" "Indeed I was. The storm had made going out quite impossible. I spent the evening reading by the fire and retired early, around 10. The constable mentioned that you saw a light in the Wetherby garden that evening." Mr. Alcott looked at her sharply, and Miss Marple returned his gaze with the innocent expression of one merely making conversation. "I did," he said slowly. "Around 10 o'clock, as near as I can judge. I'd gone upstairs to fetch a book from my bedroom and happened to glance out the window. The Wetherby Cottage was dark, or seemed to be from the front, but I distinctly saw a lantern moving in the garden behind the house." "A lantern?" said Mrs. Langdon. "But surely Mrs. Wetherby wouldn't have been out in such weather." "That's precisely what struck me as odd at the time. It was bitter cold, and the snow was still falling heavily. I watched for several minutes, trying to make out what was happening. The light moved from the back door toward the hedge, then disappeared. I assumed someone had gone through the gap in the hedge into the field beyond. Someone. Miss Marple's tone was mild. "Not Mr. Wetherby?" Then I couldn't say with certainty. The figure was bundled in coat and scarf, and the snow made visibility poor. But my impression was of someone smaller than Henry Wetherby, slighter in build. "You know Mr. Wetherby well?" "As well as one knows any neighbor. We've exchanged greetings, discussed the weather, that sort of thing. He's not a man who encourages intimacy." His wife was more forthcoming when one encountered her. Miss Marple detected a note of sympathy in his voice. "You spoke with Mrs. Wetherby often?" "Not often, but occasionally. She would sometimes walk this way in the afternoons, and we'd chat across the hedge. She was interested in the bees, I recall, asked quite intelligent questions about their habits. He paused, then added quietly, "She seemed lonely," I thought, as though village life didn't quite suit her. Did she ever mention wanting to leave? Mr. Alcott considered the question carefully. Not in so many words, but about a week before she died, I encountered her at the post office. She was sending a telegram and seemed quite agitated. When I asked if anything was wrong, she said only that she might be going to London soon, and that Henry didn't know yet. Then she caught herself as though she'd said too much and hurried away. Mrs. Langdon shifted uncomfortably in her chair, but Miss Marple leaned forward with interest. "A telegram, you say? Do you happen to know to whom it was addressed?" I couldn't see the form clearly, but I did notice it was to a London address. Bloomsbury, I believe. How very observant of you. The hazard of teaching for 40 years, Mr. Alcott said dryly. One develops a habit of noticing details. And the night she died, did you hear anything unusual? Voices, perhaps, or movement in the cottage? Nothing. The walls are thick, and the storm was loud enough to cover most sounds. That's what troubles me, Miss Marple. If I had heard something, raised an alarm... He broke off, his scholarly face drawn with genuine distress. You mustn't blame yourself, said Mrs. Langdon gently. No one could have known. Perhaps. But there's something else that has troubled me since that night. When I saw the lantern in the garden, I watched to see if it would return to the house. It did not. It disappeared through the hedge, and I saw no further light. Yet when Henry Wetherby arrived the next morning, the back door was locked from the inside. I heard him tell the constable so. Miss Marple's needles, which had been moving steadily throughout the conversation, paused for the briefest moment. Locked from the inside? You're certain that's what he said? He had to go around to the front to let himself in with his key. How very interesting, murmured Miss Marple. After they had left Mr. Alcott's cottage, Mrs. Langdon burst out, Jane, what does it mean if someone left through the garden with a lantern and the door was locked from inside? It means, my dear Constance, that either Mr. Alcott was mistaken about what he saw, or someone is not telling the truth. And I'm inclined to believe that Mr. Alcott, with his scholarly habits of observation, was not mistaken at all. They walked in silence for a moment before Miss Marple added, almost to herself. The snow that night preserved everything. You see every footprint, every movement. It's rather like a photograph, if one knows how to read it properly. And what it tells me is that someone left Wetherby Cottage through the garden on Wednesday night after the snow had fallen, and did not return by the same route. But who and why? Ah, said Miss Marple, those are precisely the questions we must answer, and I suspect that when we do, we shall find that poor Clara Wetherby's death was not the simple accident everyone believes it to be. Chapter 6. A Story. That doesn't match Sunday morning brought clear skies and the tolling of church bells across Lower Wetherby. Miss Marple, walking to morning service with Mrs. Langdon, observed that the village had turned out in force, no doubt drawn as much by curiosity as by devotion. Henry Wetherby sat alone in the third pew on the left, his dark suit impeccable, his face composed in an expression of dignified grief. Miss Marple, from her position several rows behind, watched him throughout the service. He never once turned his head, never fidgeted or shifted in his seat. Even during the vicar's pointed sermon on the brevity of earthly life, he remained perfectly still, his hands folded in his lap with geometric precision. It was, Miss Marple reflected, rather too perfect a performance. After the service, as the congregation filed out into the pale winter sunlight, Constable Mellis approached Henry Wetherby with apologetic deference. Begging your pardon, Mr. Wetherby, but the inspector from Much Benham would like a word. Just a formality, you understand. For the inquest, if you could spare a few minutes. Miss Marple, who happened to be standing near enough to overhear this exchange, noticed the slight tightening of Henry Wetherby's jaw before he nodded assent. Of course, Constable. I'm at your disposal. The three men moved aside to the lich gate, and Miss Marple, with the talent for unobtrusive positioning she had perfected over many years, found herself close enough to hear their conversation, while apparently absorbed in examining the memorial plaques on the church wall. The inspector, a competent-looking man named Graves, spoke with professional courtesy. I understand you've already given your account to Constable Mellis, Mr. Wetherby, but I'd like to go through it once more. If you don't mind, just to ensure we have everything clear for the coroner. Certainly. Henry Wetherby's voice was steady. I left for Much Benham on Wednesday afternoon around 3. I had business with a client of the firm, a matter requiring immediate attention. I intended to catch the 6:15 train back that evening. But you didn't catch that train? No. The business took longer than anticipated, and by the time I reached the station, I'd missed it. The next train wasn't until morning, and with the storm coming on, I decided to take a room at the Railway Inn, rather than wait about in the cold. What time did you arrive at the inn? There was the briefest hesitation before Henry replied. Shortly after 10, I believe. The innkeeper has the time as nearer to 11, Inspector Graves said mildly. Does he? Well, I may be mistaken. It was a difficult evening, and I wasn't paying particular attention to the time. Miss Marple's needles clicked softly as she absorbed this exchange. That discrepancy was hardly trivial. And you returned to Lower Wetherby the next morning? Yes. I caught the first train, arrived at the station around 9, and walked home. The roads were impossible for vehicles. When I reached the cottage and received no answer to my knock, I let myself in with my key and found my wife in the morning room. His voice caught slightly on the final words. But Miss Marple, watching his reflection in the brass memorial plaque before her, saw that his eyes remained dry. The back door was locked. You told Constable Mellis. Yes, locked from the inside, with a bolt drawn. I had to go around to the front to get in. I see. And you noticed nothing unusual about the cottage? Nothing disturbed or out of place? Nothing. Everything was exactly as Clara always kept it. She was very particular about tidiness. This, Miss Marple noted with interest, directly contradicted what Annie Carter had said about Clara complaining of her husband's excessive attention to order. A small point, perhaps, but significant. The inspector consulted his notebook. Your neighbor, Mr. Alcott, reports seeing a light in your garden around 10 o'clock Wednesday evening. Can you account for that? I cannot. I wasn't there, as I've explained. Perhaps Clara went out for some reason, though I can't imagine why in such weather. The light moved toward the hedge and disappeared, he says. Henry Wetherby's voice took on a slight edge. Then perhaps Mr. Alcott was mistaken. The snow creates odd effects with light and shadow. Or perhaps it was someone cutting through from the field. It happens occasionally, though we've discouraged it. Quite so. Inspector Graves closed his notebook. Well, that seems clear enough. The inquest is scheduled for Tuesday. You'll need to attend, of course. I shall be there. As the men dispersed, Miss Marple made her way thoughtfully back to where Mrs. Langdon waited by the church path. Did you hear, Jane? The inspector seemed satisfied it was an accident. So it would appear, said Miss Marple. That afternoon she suggested a walk to the village, and Mrs. Langdon, grateful for the occupation, readily agreed. Their route took them past the Railway Inn, a modest establishment with a painted sign swinging in the breeze. I wonder, said Miss Marple, pausing at the door, if they might have a pot of tea available. I find I'm rather chilled. The innkeeper, a jovial man named Wilkes, was happy to accommodate them. As he brought the tea tray, Miss Marple remarked conversationally, What a dreadful week you've had, with the storm and then poor Mr. Wetherby's loss. Him staying here that very night, not knowing what had happened at home. Miss Dreadful indeed. And him staying here that very night, not knowing what had happened at home. Came in near 11, he did, looking like he'd seen a ghost, white as a sheet, and shaking. The cold, I expect, murmured Miss Marple. Maybe so, though the evening wasn't so very bitter until later. But he went straight up to his room without supper, and I didn't see him again until morning, paid his bill and left on the first train. He did. You're certain of the time he arrived? Near 11, you said? Oh, yes, miss. I remember particular because I was just winding the clock in the hallway when he came in. 11 o'clock exactly, or near enough. After they left the inn, Mrs. Langdon said wonderingly, But Jane, Mr. Wetherby told the inspector he arrived shortly after 10. Why would he lie about such a thing? An excellent question, my dear, and there are others just as puzzling. Why did he look as though he'd seen a ghost when he arrived? The storm was bad, certainly, but hardly ghost-inducing. And why go straight to his room without supper? A man who has missed his train and spent hours traveling would surely be hungry, unless he had something on his mind that destroyed his appetite, precisely, or unless he had been somewhere, other than where he claimed to be, doing something that left him in no state for casual conversation with an innkeeper. They walked on in silence until they reached Whodunit Cottage. As they removed their coats in the hallway, Mrs. Langdon said hesitantly, Jane, do you truly believe Henry Wetherby killed his wife? Miss Marple hung up her coat with careful deliberation before answering. I believe, Constance, that a man who lies about where he was and when he arrived is a man with something to hide. I believe that a marriage in which one party keeps secrets and the other demands perfect control is a marriage heading toward tragedy. And I believe that two teacups set out for tea, one drunk and one untouched, tell a story that has nothing to do with faulty gas heaters. But how could he have done it? He wasn't there. The innkeeper confirms he was in Much Benham. Confirms that he arrived at 11, Miss Marple corrected gently. But between 6, when he claimed to have missed his train, and 11, when he appeared at the inn, there are 5 hours unaccounted for. Quite long enough, I should think, to travel back to Lower Wetherby, do what needed to be done, and return to Much Benham. Mrs. Langdon sank into a chair, her comfortable face distressed. Oh, Jane, it's too horrible to contemplate. Murder usually is, said Miss Marple quietly. But contemplating it is the only way to ensure that justice is done, and that poor Clara Wetherby's death is not dismissed as a mere unfortunate accident. Chapter 7. The Letter from London Monday. Morning found Miss Marple making her way to the post office, a small establishment tucked between the greengrocer's and the baker's shop. The postmistress, Mrs. Dorrs, was a woman of indeterminate age, with sharp eyes and an air of knowing rather more than she ought about everyone's business. "Good morning," said Miss Marple pleasantly. "I wonder if you might help me. I'm expecting a parcel from my nephew, but it seems to have gone astray. I thought perhaps it might have been delivered here by mistake." This fiction served its purpose admirably. Mrs. Dorrs became immediately helpful, checking through her records and expressing sympathy for the vagaries of the postal service. As she did so, Miss Marple remarked casually, "What a responsibility you have, ensuring all the village correspondence is properly handled. I expect you knew poor Mrs. Wetherby." "Oh, yes, miss. She came in regular for stamps and such. A nice young lady, though perhaps a bit too modern in her ways for Lower Wetherby. I understand she received a telegram on the day she died." Mrs. Dorrs looked up sharply, then seemed to decide that Miss Marple's elderly respectability made her a suitable confidant. "She did indeed, miss. Wednesday afternoon." It arrived around 2. But with the storm coming on and my boy Jack laid up with a cold, I couldn't get it delivered until late. How late would you say? Must have been near 7 when I finally made it to Wetherby Cottage. The snow was already falling thick, and I was anxious to get home before it got worse. I knocked at the door, but there was no answer. Miss Marple's needles paused. No answer at all? Not a sound, miss? The cottage was dark, too, or seemed to be from the front. I thought perhaps Mrs. Wetherby had gone to bed early, what with her husband being away, so I slipped the telegram through the letterbox and hurried home. You're quite certain of the time? Oh, yes, miss. The church clock was striking 7 as I came down the lane. This, Miss Marple reflected, was most significant. If Clara Wetherby had been in the cottage at 7, why had she not answered the door? And if she had already been overcome by gas fumes, how had the telegram ended up on the bureau where Constable Mellis had presumably seen it the next morning? The telegram, Miss Marple said carefully. Would you happen to recall what it said? I know it's not quite proper to ask, but in the circumstances... Mrs. Dorris glanced around the empty shop, then leaned forward conspiratorially. Well, miss, seeing as the poor lady is dead and it can't hurt her now, I don't suppose there's any harm in telling you. It said, we'll call again Thursday. Urgent. J.R. Sent from a post office in Bloomsbury. J.R. repeated Miss Marple softly. How interesting. And Mrs. Wetherby never received it, you think? I couldn't say for certain, miss. I pushed it through the letterbox, as I told you. Whether she found it before what happened, well, that I don't know. Miss Marple thanked Mrs. Dorrs and made her way back to Rose Cottage, her mind turning over this new information. A telegram from London sent by someone with the initials J.R. Mr. Alcott had mentioned that Clara had spoken of a man from London who had called the previous week. And Annie Carter had referred to James Rowe, the man Clara had known before her marriage. The pieces were beginning to form a pattern. That afternoon, Miss Marple suggested to Mrs. Langdon that they might call on the vicar's wife, whose knowledge of parish affairs was, she had learned, both extensive and reliable. Mrs. Clement received them in her comfortable drawing room, where a bright fire dispelled the lingering winter chill. She was a woman of about 50 with kind eyes and the sort of practical intelligence Miss Marple always found valuable. Such a terrible business about Mrs. Wetherby, she said, pouring tea. The vicar is quite distressed about it. He feels he should have done more, though what more he could have done I'm sure I don't know. You were acquainted with her, I believe? Miss Marple inquired, slightly. She came to church occasionally, though not as regularly as her husband. A pleasant young woman, though I always felt she was. How shall I put it, not quite settled, as though she were waiting for something. The gentleman from London you mentioned to Mrs. Langdon, did you observe anything particular about his visit? Mrs. Clement set down her cup with care. I've thought about that a great deal since poor Clara died. He arrived by motor car, which was unusual for Lower Wetherby. Most visitors come by train. He was well dressed, a man of perhaps 35, with a London look about him. Professional, I should say, from his bearing. And Mrs. Wetherby's reaction to seeing him. That's what struck me as so odd, Miss Marple. When she opened the door and saw who it was, she put her hand to her throat. In that way one does when startled or distressed. Then she looked up and down the lane almost furtively before letting him in. I had the distinct impression she didn't want anyone to know he was there. How long did he stay? Perhaps 20 minutes. When he left, I happened to be in my garden cutting the last of the winter roses. I saw him emerge, and Clara stood at the door watching him go. She had a letter in her hand. I noticed a folded piece of paper at any rate, and her face. Well, I can only describe it as conflicted, hopeful and frightened at the same time, if that makes any sense. Perfect sense, murmured Miss Marple. The next day, Wednesday morning, I encountered her at the post office. She seemed agitated, kept glancing about as though worried someone might overhear. She told me she expected to be going to London soon, and that everything would be different. Those were her exact words. Everything will be different. Then she caught herself, as though she had said too much, and hurried away. After they had left the vicarage, Mrs. Langdon said, "The letter Clara was writing when she died, do you suppose it was to this James Rowe?" "Almost certainly, and I suspect the fragment that Constable Mellis saw, the paper with just 2 words on it, was not the beginning of a letter, but the ending of one that had been torn up." "What 2 words?" "I know. A very significant phrase, don't you think? It suggests Clara had discovered something, some piece of knowledge that changed everything." They had reached Rose Cottage, and Miss Marple paused at the gate. "Constance, I need to know exactly what happened to that letter. Whether it was posted, and if so, when and by whom." "But Mr. Wetherby took it," the constable said. "Precisely, which means either he posted it himself or he destroyed it. And I very much suspect it was the latter." That evening, as they sat by the fire after supper, Miss Marple said thoughtfully, "A woman writes 'I know' and expects to go to London to meet a man from her past. A telegram arrives promising a visit on Thursday, but the woman dies on Wednesday night, and the telegram is found in the cottage the next morning, despite the postmistress receiving no answer when she delivered it at 7. What does that suggest to you?" Mrs. Langdon considered. "That someone else was in the cottage, someone who picked up the telegram after it was pushed through the letterbox." "Exactly. Someone who wanted to know what Clara knew, and who could not allow her to go to London to meet James Rowe. Someone who had 5 unaccounted hours between 6 and 11, and who arrived at the inn looking as though he had seen a ghost." "Henry Wetherby," whispered Mrs. Langdon. Miss Marple nodded slowly. Henry Wetherby, who could not bear the thought of his wife leaving him, who had discovered her plan to run away, and who decided that if he could not possess her, no one else would either. Chapter 8. The window that wouldn't open Tuesday morning dawned gray and cold, with the promise of more snow in the air. The inquest was scheduled for 2 at the village hall, and Miss Marple had determined that before it took place, she must examine Wetherby Cottage one final time. "I'm not certain it's wise, Jane," said Mrs. Langdon anxiously. "If Mr. Wetherby should find you there—" "Mr. Wetherby," Miss Marple replied calmly, "will be occupied this morning with the undertaker and his solicitor. Constable Mellis mentioned it yesterday. I shall have ample time to satisfy my curiosity." The cottage stood silent and shuttered when Miss Marple arrived. She had taken the precaution of bringing a basket of preserves, her excuse being that she wished to leave them on the doorstep as a gesture of sympathy. But once she had assured herself that no one was about, she tried the front door and found it, as she had hoped, unlocked. The interior was cold and dim, the curtains still drawn as Henry Wetherby had left them. Miss Marple made her way directly to the morning room, her eyes adjusting to the gloom. The tea tray had been removed, she noted, and the room had been tidied, but the essential elements remained unchanged. The chair where Clara had died, the gas heater against the wall, the bureau by the window, and the window itself with its broken latch. Miss Marple examined the heater first. It was a modern apparatus with a valve for controlling the flow of gas and a pilot light that could be adjusted. She studied it carefully, noting the position of the valve and the accumulation of soot around the burner. The pattern was curious, heavier on one side than the other, suggesting the flame had been burning unevenly. She knelt down, her old knees protesting slightly, and peered more closely at the valve. There, barely visible on the brass knob, were faint smudges of ash, not the sort of ash that would accumulate naturally from the burning gas, but darker, grittier, the ash from a coal or wood fire. Standing with some effort, Miss Marple moved to the window. The broken latch hung uselessly, just as she had observed before, but it was the string securing the window that held her attention now. She examined it closely, noting how it had been wound around the inside handle, and then threaded through a small gap in the window frame to reach what must be a hook or nail on the outside. With careful fingers, she unwound the string from the inside handle and let it hang loose. Then she opened the window. It moved smoothly despite the broken latch, and she leaned out to examine the exterior frame. Yes, there it was, a small hook screwed into the wood, positioned so that string could be looped around it from inside the room, and if one were clever, one could close the window, secure the string to the inside handle, and then she worked it through in her mind. Yes, one could pull the string tight from outside, creating tension that would hold the window closed. Then by threading the loose end back through the gap and tying it off on the outside hook, one could leave the room, close the window behind oneself, and leave it apparently secured from within. It would take practice and precision, but it could be done. And Henry Wetherby, she reflected, was a man who paid meticulous attention to such details, but there was more. Once outside, with the window closed and secured by the string, one could simply cut the string on the outside, pull it free, and tie it again from the exterior, leaving no evidence of having escaped through the window at all. The broken latch would prevent anyone from opening the window to discover the deception, and the string would appear to be merely a makeshift repair for a faulty lock. Miss Marple closed the window and carefully rewound the string as she had found it. She was not quite finished with the room. The bureau yielded little. Its drawers were empty, save for some writing paper and envelopes, but on the leather writing surface, she could still see the faint indentation where Clara's final letter had rested. Miss Marple ran her fingers lightly over the marks, trying to make out the words. The pressure of the pen had been hard enough to leave impressions in the leather. She could make out fragments, must tell you, and lower down, he suspects, and finally, most clearly, the two words the constable had mentioned, I know. So Clara had indeed been writing to James Rowe, telling him something urgent, something Henry could not allow to be communicated. And Henry, returning to the cottage under cover of darkness and storm, had found the letter and destroyed it, all but that one damning fragment. Miss Marple turned her attention to the chair where Clara had died. It was positioned near the heater, close enough to have received the full effect of the gas fumes. The cushion still bore the faint impression of a woman's form, and on the arm of the chair, Miss Marple noticed something she had not seen before, a light dusting of white powder, the same powder that had left its residue on the rim of Clara's teacup. She moistened her finger and touched it to the powder, then brought it cautiously to her nose. Face powder, certainly, but something else as well. A faint chemical smell that was not perfume. Miss Marple had known a case once in St. Mary Mead where a young woman had been poisoned with a sleeping draught mixed into her evening cocoa. The powder had left just such a residue on the cup. She straightened up, her mind assembling the sequence of events with increasing certainty. Clara, alone in the cottage, had made tea for herself and for the visitor she expected, perhaps James Rowe, whose telegram had promised to call again on Thursday, or perhaps Henry himself, whom she thought safely away in Much Benham. The powder in one cup suggested that cup had been prepared specially, designed to make the drinker drowsy and unable to resist what came next. But which cup had contained the powder? The one Clara drank from, or the untouched cup meant for someone else? Miss Marple considered the white residue on Clara's cup and on the chair arm. If Clara had handled her face powder compact while drinking her tea, the powder might have transferred naturally. But the chemical smell suggested something more sinister. Henry Wetherby had returned to the cottage that evening. The footprints in the snow confirmed someone had been there. He had entered through the back door using his key, found Clara drowsy, or perhaps already unconscious from the drugged tea, and then methodically set about creating the appearance of an accident. The gas heater valve adjusted to release fumes slowly, the window secured by the clever string arrangement, the back door locked from inside before he escaped through the window, and finally, the string arrangement completed from outside, the evidence of his exit erased. A sound from outside startled Miss Marple from her thoughts. Voices approaching down the lane. She moved quickly to the front door and let herself out, pulling it closed behind her just as Henry Wetherby came into view, accompanied by a man in a dark suit, whom she took to be the solicitor. "Miss Marple," Henry said, his voice carefully neutral. "I wasn't aware you were calling." "I've just left some preserves on your step," Miss Marple replied with perfect composure. "A small token from Mrs. Langdon and myself. I do hope I haven't intruded." "Not at all." "How kind." But his pale eyes, Miss Marple noticed, had gone to the door and then to the window of the morning room, as though checking that everything remained as he had left it. As she walked back to Rose Cottage, Miss Marple knew with absolute certainty that Henry Wetherby had murdered his wife. The method was clear, the motive established, the opportunity proven. All that remained was to ensure that the truth came to light before the inquest concluded with a verdict of accidental death. Chapter 9. The Fire That Shouldn't Be Burning, the Death. Inquest had concluded at 4 with a verdict of accidental death. Miss Marple, sitting quietly at the back of the village hall, had watched Henry Wetherby give his testimony with that same careful precision she had observed in everything he did. The coroner had expressed sympathy. Dr. Haydock had confirmed his findings, and the matter had been declared closed. But Miss Marple knew it was far from closed. That evening, as darkness fell early over Lower Wetherby, she announced to Mrs. Langdon her intention to call upon Henry Wetherby. "Jane, surely not. The man has just endured an inquest." "Which is precisely why I must speak with him now," Miss Marple said firmly. "Before he has time to feel secure in his deception," Mrs. Langdon wrung her hands. "But what will you say to him? You can't simply accuse him of murder." "I shall say very little," Miss Marple replied, pulling on her gloves. "Sometimes, my dear Constance, the best way to make a guilty person reveal himself is simply to let him know that someone has seen through his lies. The weight of that knowledge often becomes unbearable." The walk to Wetherby Cottage seemed longer in the darkness. A light snow had begun to fall, soft flakes that caught in Miss Marple's hair and melted on her cheeks. When she reached the cottage, she could see a warm glow through the sitting-room window. For a moment she hesitated, then knocked firmly at the door. Henry Wetherby answered after a brief delay. He had removed his coat and tie and looked almost human in his shirt sleeves and waistcoat. Almost, but not quite. His eyes held that same watchful wariness she had noted before. "Miss Marple, this is unexpected. I hope you'll forgive the intrusion, Mr. Wetherby. I felt I should return your call, as it were. You were so courteous in receiving me the other day." He could hardly refuse her entry. With visible reluctance, he stepped back and ushered her into the sitting room. A fire burned brightly in the grate, and the room was warm, almost too warm. Miss Marple accepted the chair he offered and observed that he had been reading. A book lay face down on the table beside his own chair, a glass of whiskey beside it. "I shan't keep you long," Miss Marple said, removing her gloves. "I merely wish to express my condolences once more, now that the inquest is concluded. It must have been a great ordeal for you." "It was necessary," he said, resuming his seat. "These formalities must be observed. Indeed, though I confess, I found some aspects of the proceedings rather puzzling." His hand, reaching for the poker to adjust the fire, paused for the merest fraction of a second. "Puzzling, Miss Marple?" Perhaps puzzling is too strong a word. Curious might be better, small inconsistencies that probably mean nothing at all. He lifted the poker and stirred the fire, sending up a shower of sparks. Miss Marple watched the movement carefully, noting the tool he used, a brass poker with an ornate handle, the sort that would leave distinctive marks if used to adjust other things besides coal. What sort of inconsistencies? His tone was casual, but his shoulders had tightened perceptibly. Oh, matters of timing, primarily. You said you arrived at the Railway Inn shortly after 10, but the innkeeper recalls it as 11. And the postmistress delivered a telegram at 7 that evening, yet no one answered the door, though your wife must have been in the cottage. Small things, as I say. Henry Wetherby replaced the poker in its stand with careful precision. I may have been mistaken about the time I arrived at the inn. As for the telegram, my wife might have been in the bath or perhaps in the back of the house where she wouldn't have heard the knock. Of course. And then there's the matter of the footprints in the snow, the ones that didn't quite match your boots. But snow can be deceptive, can it? Especially in a storm. Extremely deceptive. His voice had gone very flat. Miss Marple continued in her mild conversational tone. The room where your wife died interested me particularly. That clever arrangement of string on the window, quite ingenious really, as a way to secure a broken latch. I imagine it took some thought to work out. His face had gone pale, but he said nothing. And the gas heater, Miss Marple went on, her eyes fixed on the poker he had just used. I noticed ash marks on the valve, the sort that might be left by someone adjusting it with a tool rather than bare hands. A poker, perhaps, or some similar implement. The same sort of ash, I should think. That one gets from stirring a cold fire. Henry Wetherby's hand, resting on the arm of his chair, had begun to tremble slightly. What are you suggesting, Miss Marple? I'm suggesting nothing. Mr. Wetherby, I'm merely observing, for instance, that the telegram your wife received, the one from J.R., promising to call again on Thursday, must have caused you considerable alarm when you found it. I don't know what you mean. I think you do. James Rowe, that was his name, wasn't it? The man your wife knew before she married you. The man she was planning to run away with, taking her inheritance with her. The man she wrote to on the evening she died, telling him, I know, though what she knew I cannot say for certain. Perhaps she had discovered something about you, some reason you had been so eager to marry a woman with money. Or perhaps she had simply realized that her marriage was a prison, and that you would never let her go. This is outrageous! But his voice lacked conviction. Is it? Then perhaps you can explain how you came to be at Wetherby Cottage on Wednesday evening, when you claimed to be in Much Benham. How you let yourself in with your key, found your wife drowsy from the sleeping draught you had somehow, persuaded her to take in her tea, suspect, and then arranged the scene so carefully to look like an accident. Henry Wetherby had risen from his chair, his face now deathly white. You're mad. I was in Much Benham. The innkeeper confirmed it. The innkeeper confirmed you arrived at 11. That gave you 5 hours, Mr. Wetherby. 5 hours to travel back to Lower Wetherby in a hired motor car, do what you had planned, and return to establish your alibi. The storm was perfect for your purposes. The roads nearly impossible, but not quite. And everyone would assume you'd been delayed by the weather, not suspect that you had made the journey twice. You have no proof of any of this. Don't I? Miss Marple's voice was gentle but implacable. The string arrangement on the window that allowed you to escape and leave the room locked. The ash marks on the gas heater valve. The telegram that was delivered at 7 to an apparently empty house, yet was found inside the next morning. The footprints that didn't match your boots because they were made hours before you supposedly arrived. And most damning of all, the residue in your wife's teacup. Not just face powder, but something else. Something that made her drowsy and unable to resist when you adjusted the gas heater and left her to die. He sank back into his chair, his face in his hands. For a long moment, there was silence except for the crackling of the fire. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely audible. She was going to leave me, take everything and go back to him. After all I had done, all I had sacrificed. You had sacrificed nothing, Miss Marple said quietly. You had married for money and convenience. And when your wife wished to reclaim her own life, you decided that if you could not possess her, no one else would. I loved her, he said, but the word sounded hollow even to him. Love? Miss Marple's tone held a note of infinite sadness. No, Mr. Wetherby, love releases. What you felt was possession, and possession turned to rage when you realized she was slipping from your grasp. Chapter 10. Truth at Wetherby. Cottage Inspector Graves arrived at Wetherby Cottage within the hour, summoned by a message Miss Marple had arranged to have delivered the moment Henry Wetherby's composure had begun to crack. The inspector brought Constable Mellis with him, and together they listened as Henry Wetherby, his careful facade finally shattered, made his confession. Miss Marple remained in her chair by the fire, a silent witness to the unraveling of a murder that had nearly been perfect. I knew she was planning to leave, Henry began, his voice mechanical, as though reciting a lesson learned by rote. I'd suspected for weeks. She was secretive, always checking the post before I could see it, hiding letters. Then I found one from him, from James Rowe. It was in her desk drawer underneath some household accounts. He wanted her back. Said he'd made a mistake letting her go, that he'd loved her all along. Inspector Graves made notes in his book, his face impassive. When did you discover this letter? A fortnight ago. I confronted her about it, but she denied everything. Said Rowe was just an old friend, nothing more. But I could see she was lying. I knew that look. The same look she'd had when we were courting, when she'd told me she loved me. His voice turned bitter. She'd never loved me. She'd married me because Rowe had disappointed her somehow, and I was convenient. The money from her aunt made her independent, made her think she could just walk away. So you decided to kill her? Said Inspector Graves quietly. Henry's hands clenched on the arms of his chair. I decided she wouldn't leave me. Not for him, not for anyone. Tell us how you did it, the inspector prompted. The confession came slowly, painfully, but it came. Henry described how he had obtained a sleeping draught from a chemist in Much Benham, claiming he needed it for insomnia, how he had ground the tablets into powder and hidden them in his desk drawer, how he had planned everything meticulously, waiting for the right opportunity. The business trip to Much Benham was genuine, he said, but I knew the storm was coming. I'd checked the weather reports. I knew the roads would be nearly impossible, and that would give me my excuse. I left on Wednesday afternoon as planned, but I'd already arranged with a man I knew to hire his motor car. I paid him well to ask no questions. What time did you return to Lower Wetherby? Inspector Graves asked. 6:30, perhaps a bit later. I parked the motor car in the lane behind the church where no one would see it. Then I walked through the fields to the cottage. The snow was just beginning to fall. And your wife was alive when you arrived? Yes, she was surprised to see me, startled even. I told her I'd missed the train and decided to come home rather than stay at the inn. She accepted that, though I could see she wasn't pleased. She'd been writing a letter, and she tried to hide it when I came in. Miss Marple spoke for the first time. The letter to James Rowe, telling him you suspected her plans. Henry nodded slowly. I saw enough of it to know what she'd written. I know he suspects, meaning me. I couldn't let that letter be posted. I couldn't let her tell him. So you drugged her tea, said Inspector Graves. I suggested we have tea together to warm ourselves. She made it in the morning room, where she always took her evening tea. While she was in the kitchen fetching milk, I added the powder to her cup. She never noticed. We sat and talked, or rather, I talked meaningless chatter about my day while I watched her grow drowsy. The powder worked quickly. His voice had become almost clinical, as though he were describing something that had happened to someone else. Miss Marple recognized this detachment. She had seen it before in those who had committed acts they could not fully acknowledge as their own. When she fell asleep in her chair, I took the letter from the bureau and destroyed it, all but a fragment I missed in the grate. Then I adjusted the gas heater so it would burn slowly, releasing fumes. I knew it would take hours, but that was what I needed. Time to return to Much Benham and establish that I had been there all evening. But the window, Constable Mellis interjected. How did you get out with all the doors locked from inside? Henry's lips twisted in something that might have been pride. The broken latch gave me the idea weeks ago. I practiced with the string arrangement until I could do it perfectly. I could close the window from outside and make it appear locked from within. That night I went out through the window, secured it with the string, and walked back through the garden to where I had left the motor car. The footprints Mr. Alcott saw, said Miss Marple. Yes, I tried to step in my earlier prints where I could, but the snow was falling so heavily I couldn't see them clearly. I didn't realize Alcott had seen the lantern until later. And the telegram? The one from James Rowe? I found it when I returned on Thursday morning. It had been pushed through the letterbox, just lying there in the hall. I nearly destroyed it, but then I realized it would seem odd if a telegram had been delivered and disappeared. So I left it on the bureau in the morning room, as though Clara had seen it before she died.